You're looking at a truck driving through a Siberian blizzard. Outside, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that freezes exposed skin in under 4 minutes. The kind of cold that makes metal brittle, makes rubber crack, makes diesel fuel turn waxy in the lines. 6 soldiers in the back of that truck. Light jackets. One of them's drinking tea, another one is playing cards. There's a small device mounted on the front of that truck, near the engine bay. Most people who see it assume it's part of the exhaust system, or some kind of fuel fitting, or nothing worth a second look. It's none of those things. That device is the reason those soldiers are warm right now. It's the reason the truck started this morning, and it's the reason they'll arrive at their destination ready to fight, instead of half-frozen and barely functional. This is the Predpuskovoy Podogrevatel, the Soviet pre-start heater. It's been hiding in plain sight on military vehicles for 80 years, and almost nobody outside of cold weather engineering circles knows it exists. By the end of this video, you will. And once you understand what it actually does, and why the Soviets built it when no Western army thought it was necessary, you'll never look at cold weather engineering the same way again. If this is your first time here, subscribe and hit like. There's a lot more engineering on this channel that nobody else is bothering to explain properly. Here's what most people get wrong about engines and extreme cold. They think freezing is the problem. Ice in the coolant, cracked engine blocks, fuel lines going solid. Those are real issues, but they're not the primary killer of engines in extreme cold. The primary killer is something most people have never thought about: viscosity. Engine oil at normal operating temperature flows freely. It coats the moving surfaces, reduces friction, carries heat away from the parts that generate it. At room temperature, it does that job well. At 20 Fahrenheit, it starts thickening. At 40, it moves like cold honey. At 50, it barely flows at all through the narrow galleries inside an engine block. You're not dealing with a lubricant at that point. You're dealing with a substance that has almost no ability to reach the surfaces it needs to protect. When you try to start an engine in that condition, you are asking a starter motor to spin a crankshaft sitting inside what is essentially frozen gel. The metal surfaces that need oil have no oil. The friction is catastrophic. The wear that happens in those first few seconds, before oil reaches the bearings, before any heat builds up, before the engine reaches a temperature where things can actually move, that wear is permanent. Every cold start in extreme temperature does lasting damage to the engine, assuming it starts at all. In many cases, it simply doesn't. The starter motor burns out. The battery, already weakened by the cold, dies before the engine turns over. And then you have a 10-ton truck that is going nowhere. I remember standing next to a restored ZIL 131 at a military vehicle exhibition in Germany about 12 years ago. One of the curators, a retired engineer who had worked on Soviet vehicle maintenance documentation, mentioned something that has stuck with me since. He said that during the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan, in the winter of 1979 to 1980, units operating in the mountain passes reported losing more vehicles to cold weather engine failures in a single season than to enemy action in the same period. The vehicles weren't destroyed. They wouldn't start. That was the whole problem. He wasn't describing a fringe issue. He was describing the single largest source of vehicle attrition in that theater during that winter. Cold engines, morning after morning, in convoys that needed to move. And that problem wasn't unique to Afghanistan, the Eastern Front in the Second World War, Siberia during peacetime training exercises, the Mongolian steppe. The Soviet military had been dealing with this for decades, in places where 40 was a routine November night, and the nearest heated facility could be hundreds of kilometers away. The question Soviet engineers were trying to answer wasn't how to build a better engine. Better engines still fail in extreme cold if you approach them wrong. The question was how to bring any engine to the temperature it needs to operate safely, reliably, every single morning, with no external infrastructure, no electricity from outside the vehicle, and no margin for failure. That's a very specific engineering brief, and it produced a very specific answer. Subscribe and hit like if you're following along. Let's keep going. Western armies weren't ignoring the cold weather problem. They had solutions. Insulated engine covers that retained heat overnight. Low-viscosity synthetic oils formulated to stay liquid at lower temperatures. External heaters that plugged into base camp power supplies. Antifreeze in the cooling system. Heated vehicle storage at forward positions. All of these work. The question is where they work. They work at a base. They work when you have a power supply, a logistics chain, a facility. They work in the kind of Cold War planning scenario where NATO forces are defending prepared positions in Central Europe with infrastructure behind them. They stop working when your unit has been moving for 18 hours through open taiga, with no fixed base, no power grid, and orders to be ready to move again at 0400. They don't work when the nearest permanent structure is a 2-day drive away, and the temperature at midnight is 52. Soviet military doctrine was built around a different assumption, not the assumption of infrastructure, the assumption of its absence. Soviet planners prepared for operations in conditions where you could not count on a building, a power line, or a paved road. The support had to come with the vehicle because there was nothing else. This shaped everything about how Soviet military vehicles were designed. Fuel systems, electrical systems, tire pressure regulation, suspension clearance, engine accessibility. All of it was built for the assumption that you might be operating at the edge of the survivable world with whatever you had loaded on the truck. The pre-start heater was the most direct expression of that philosophy. It was, in the most literal sense, self-contained warmth. The truck carried its own ability to survive the night. Western engineers looked at the device and concluded it was unnecessary. Their vehicles operated in conditions where alternatives existed. Soviet engineers looked at the conditions their own vehicles actually operated in and concluded that the alternatives were all contingent on something they couldn't count on. Both were right, given their context. But only one context turned out to extend beyond the Cold War. This is the part where most videos about Soviet military equipment stop. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The Predpuskovoy Podogrevatel is simpler than it sounds. That's the first thing that strikes you when you see one properly. It's a small combustion unit, roughly cylindrical, about the size of a large thermos bottle, mounted externally near the engine bay, visible from outside the truck if you know what to look for. It runs on the same fuel as the engine, diesel or gasoline depending on the variant, drawn directly from the vehicle's own tank. It has its own small pump, its own glow plug ignition, and a set of pipes that connect into the engine's coolant circuit. To use it, the driver opens a valve inside the cab before attempting to start the engine. The device ignites. Fuel burns in the small combustion chamber. That heat warms a heat exchanger. The heat exchanger warms the coolant. The warm coolant circulates through the engine block, through the water jacket around the cylinders, through the oil cooler, through every passage where heat needs to reach. The block warms up. The oil in the sump warms up. After 15 to 20 minutes at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the driver starts the engine normally. Oil pressure comes up immediately. The engine turns freely. A truck that starts and keeps running. One detail that almost never comes up when people discuss this device. It's also used during extended stops. If a convoy halts for 2 hours in open terrain in the middle of a winter night, the drivers don't shut the heaters off. They keep them running at low output, maintaining engine temperature continuously. When the order to move comes, every truck in the convoy starts on the first attempt. No delay. No vehicle left behind because an engine wouldn't turn over at the worst possible moment. In a tactical context, starting time is not a minor detail. The difference between a vehicle that starts in 40 seconds and one that takes 20 minutes, or refuses to start at all, is the difference between a functioning unit and a crisis. What's worth paying attention to in the engineering of this device is how deliberately it avoids complexity. No electronic controls to freeze, no sensors to drift out of calibration, no software to fault. The failure modes are the failure modes of combustion. It either burns or it doesn't. If it doesn't, the driver knows immediately and can address the problem manually in the field. In the engineering culture that produced it, simplicity wasn't a stylistic preference. Soviet military equipment was designed on the assumption that it would be maintained by conscripts in field conditions, repaired with whatever tools were on hand, and operated by people who hadn't read the manual. Complexity was a liability. This device has almost none. There's a secondary effect worth understanding. At sustained low temperatures, even a functioning engine will lose heat through the block itself if it sits for long enough. The predpuskovoy podogrevatel compensated for that too. Running on minimal fuel consumption during a halt, it could maintain an already warm engine at operational temperature almost indefinitely. A convoy that stopped for 6 hours in the middle of a Siberian night, for rest, for orders, for a route problem, didn't have to restart cold engines at the end of that stop. The heater had been running the entire time. The trucks were ready when the men were ready. That reliability across extended cold weather operations was something no external solution could replicate. Subscribe. This channel is exactly this kind of engineering that gets skipped in the mainstream. And there's a lot more coming. Here's the part that changes everything about how you understand this device. The pre-start heater on Soviet military trucks wasn't only connected to the engine. On the ZIL-131 and the Ural 375D, the two most widely deployed Soviet military trucks of the Cold War era, the heating circuit ran a secondary loop back through the vehicle frame and into the troop compartment in the rear. The heat that kept the engine alive also kept the soldiers alive. This was by design. Soviet engineers explicitly built the system to serve both functions simultaneously. One device, one fuel source, two critical outputs. The soldiers in the rear compartment weren't receiving residual warmth from an engine-focused system. They were part of the thermal design from the beginning. That distinction matters. Think about what it means operationally. A convoy moving through Siberia in winter isn't just transporting soldiers. For the men inside those trucks, the vehicle is the only shelter they have for however long the journey takes. If the interior temperature drops toward outside ambient, which, without active heating, it will quickly, through the canvas sides and the metal floor, the soldiers don't arrive at their destination as a functioning combat force. They arrive with degraded motor control, reduced reaction times, the early stages of hypothermia in the worst cases. Soviet military research from the 1950s and 1960s formally measured something that had been understood informally for centuries. Soldiers exposed to severe cold for 3 to 4 hours in transit lose between 40 and 60% of their effective combat capability. The degradation happens before any medical emergency. Reaction time slows. Fine motor control, the ability to handle a weapon under pressure, work a radio, drive a vehicle in contact, drops sharply. Cognitive function follows. And this is from cold alone, before any physical exertion or psychological stress is added. The military implication is stark. A battalion that arrives from a cold transit is not a battalion at full capacity. It's a formation that needs an hour of warming and recovery before it can operate anywhere near its trained effectiveness. In a tactical scenario where the opening minutes determine everything, that's a catastrophic disadvantage built into the logistics chain itself. The preheater solved this at the source. Soldiers riding in a truck with a functioning preheater rode in a heated compartment. They arrived operational. The device wasn't just protecting the vehicle. It was protecting combat effectiveness. Those are two different engineering requirements, and the predpuskovoy podogrevatel addressed both of them with the same combustion cycle. If you're finding this useful, subscribe and hit the like button. It's the single most effective way to help this channel reach more people who'd actually want to see this kind of content. I spoke with an engineer at a Scandinavian defense contractor some years back who had studied Soviet cold weather vehicle design in considerable depth. His observation stayed with me. He said the Soviets understood that a soldier is also a system with an operating temperature range. You would not put a hydraulic actuator into service at 50 without preheating the fluid. The logic for human beings is identical. Uncomfortable framing, maybe, but it's the kind of thinking that produces equipment that works in the conditions where it actually needs to work. Western armies eventually reached similar conclusions. Slowly. The Arctic heating systems in Canadian military vehicles, the cab heating designs in Scandinavian military trucks, the insulated troop compartments in modern cold-weather personnel carriers. These are all, in different ways, answers to the same question the Soviets answered in the 1940s. The difference is when. The Predpuskovoy Podogrevatel never went away. Modern versions are standard equipment on Arctic civilian vehicles across Siberia, northern Canada, and Scandinavia. Russia's natural gas fleet operators run updated variants on every cold-weather truck in their inventory. Finnish and Swedish defense forces use systems that trace their lineage directly to Soviet designs from the early 1950s. Some of the most advanced vehicle preheating systems sold commercially today by German manufacturers, by Canadian engineering firms, are refined descendants of a solution that Soviet engineers bolted onto the front of a ZIL-131 decades before most Western procurement offices considered the problem worth solving. The technology that Western military planners dismissed as unnecessary for the better part of 40 years turned out to be the correct answer to a problem that doesn't go away. The world has cold places. Those cold places have roads. Those roads have vehicles. Those vehicles need to start in the morning, and the people inside them need to arrive functional. There's something worth sitting with in that history. The best engineering solutions rarely come from the best funded programs or the most advanced laboratories. They come from the most brutal constraints. The Soviet engineers who designed this device weren't working with unlimited development budgets in well-equipped research facilities. They were trying to stop their operational fleet from dying overnight in conditions that would kill the engineers themselves if they stood outside long enough. Extreme necessity produces clear thinking, when the margin between working and not working is the margin between a mission succeeding and soldiers dying. There's no room for solutions that are elegant but fragile. There's only room for solutions that work. That small cylindrical device on the front of a ZIL-131 is what working looks like. Next time you see a Soviet military truck, in a documentary, in a museum, in footage from somewhere cold, look at the engine bay. There's something there that most people walk straight past. Now you know what it is, and what it saved. What's the most impressive piece of cold weather engineering you've ever come across? Leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. And the next video is already on your screen. See you there.